There's a lot of stories like this in the Gemara, but the one that comes to mind is that Rabbi Yochanan was learning with Rav Kahana for the first time, and when he lifted up his eyes, he saw that Rav Kahana was smirking. So he wasn't really smirking, but he had some birth defect, and Rabbi Yochanan was displeased, and Rav Kahana died on the spot. So, but my question really is a general question about these kind of stories, which is why doesn't the rabbi who's doing the gazing or the killing kind of, why doesn't he just don the havschus? Like, why couldn't he just think that, oh, but Rav Kahana might have some sort of birth defect, he's not really smirking at me.
Yeah. Again, it happens to be particularly about Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan had this, seems like a gaze that could just put you to death, and the like X-ray vision or heat vision, like Superman used to have heat vision, and the like. So you have to understand what's going on. Certainly, I think the Pasha says Rav Yochanan did not intend to murder people. Rav Yochanan wasn't staring at people with the intention of killing them. But what happens is that when a great Talmid Chacham is hurt or offended, HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes revenge, so to speak. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will avenge the pain of a great person. So when the Gemara describes Rav Yochanan looked at the person and the person burnt up, that meant Rav Yochanan was hurt. Now it could be that maybe Rav Yochanan then did judge him l'kafsuchus, but if initially Rav Yochanan had even 1 second of agmas nefesh, that could have a tremendous repercussion of very, very negative consequences. We see this, I'll give you another example of it. In Bava Metzia, we have the famous Gemara where Rabbi Eliezer was put in Cherem because he refused to accept the decision of the majority. Do you remember that's when he did a lot of miracles? The tree uprooted itself and the water reversed its course, and the walls of the Beis HaMedrash were going to collapse, and a voice from heaven said the halachas like Rabbi Eliezer, and the Chachamim still said, we don't listen. Lo b'shamayim, we don't even listen to God. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus was excommunicated, and the Gemara the Nasi of the Sanhedrin was Rabbi Gamliel, and the Gemara says Rabbi Gamliel was married to Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus' sister. So it's brought down in the Gemara that Rabbi Eliezer was married to Rabbi Gamliel's sister. So it mentions that Rabbi Eliezer's wife never let him say Tachanun after Shemona Esrei, because Tachanun is a time that you express your anguish to God, and she was afraid that would hurt her brother. But so she used to watch him and interrupt him so he wouldn't say Tachanun right away. So one day she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, so she didn't have to watch him. There's no Rosh Tachanun Rosh Chodesh. And it turned out it wasn't Rosh Chodesh. She saw him saying Tachanun, and she said to him, you killed my brother today. And the Gemara says she immediately got the news that Rabbi Gamliel, her brother, had died. Now again, the assumption is not that Rabbi Eliezer prayed that Rabbi Gamliel would die. That's not what we have to assume. But rather, when Rabbi Eliezer feels that anguish and feels that pain, Hashem, so to speak, avenges the kavod of the gadol. So I think that's what's going on with Rabbi Yochanan as well. Of course, you'll recall the first part of the story that you didn't mention is also very, very interesting. Rav Shimon ben Lakish was Rav Yochanan's brother-in-law. He had married Rav Yochanan's sister, and he had started off life as a highway robber, and he attacked Rav Yochanan once, and Rav Yochanan promised that if you learn Torah, you can marry my sister. And what happened was, every time Rav Yochanan said anything, Resh Lakish would ask him 24 kashas. And Resh Lakish died. That's also a tragic story. And they replaced him with Rav Kahana, who every time Rav Yochanan said something, Rav Kahana gave him 24 proofs that he was right. And Rav Yochanan started crying. He says, where is Resh Lakish? I didn't need somebody to tell me I was right. I needed someone to question me, because then I would either be choser, or I would qualify, or I would explain things better, understand things better. So that also tells you that you don't need, both in marriage and in learning, you don't necessarily need a yes man that says everything you say is right, but to question and discuss brings out the Torah. And that's why Rav Yochanan missed Reish Lakish and actually was not happy with Rav Kahana, even before the thinking Rav Kahana was mocking him and the like. But it just shows you how chomer it is. In fact, I can tell you a story I just came across this week. It's a famous story, but I had forgotten the details about the tremendous cost in being Mavaza Talmud Chacham. This is a fascinating little story. I don't want to take up too much time with it. There was a town in the Ukraine, I'm not sure if it's still around, Slavita. And in the 1800s, the printing press in Slavita was owned by some very chashuva Hasidic Yidden. And they wanted to print a beautiful Shas. In fact, the Slavita Shas is still considered to be one of the most beautiful Shasin ever printed. It went on the market recently, I think, an old copy of it, for $30,000, which is not huge, but for a Shas, and that's a pretty good price for a Shas. But they didn't want to invest all the money unless they got a haskama from the Rabbanim that nobody could print another Shas for 10 years. That was the custom in those days, an exclusivity period. So the Slavita Shas was printed. They managed to sell virtually everything they printed, but it was still within the 10 years. So they figured they would print a second edition and get more profit. The famous Vilna Shas started printing their Shas during the 10-year period. So the Slavita people brought a din Torah. They went to the great Rebbe Kiva Eger. And Rebbe Kiva Eger paskind that Vilna has the right to print the Shas because the 10-year exclusivity period simply meant that until it was to give them time to sell their Shas and recoup their investment. But if they recoup their investment within the 10 years, then you're back to competition. So Vilna was allowed to progress. So the Slavita Madfisim, they said, well, they didn't think the psak was right. And they said, maybe Rebbe Kiva Eger is getting a little old. And then they had some taina that maybe he was influenced by his son, Rav Shlomo Eger, who had a financial interest in the Vilna press. And Rebbe Kiva Eger, who was the most humble and mild-mannered of people, he was furious. He said this was a bizayon of kavod HaTorah, and he said he can't be mochel, the bizayon of kavod HaTorah. What happened after that is literally a nightmare. It's one of the worst nightmares you could possibly imagine. Somehow the next day, some guy, non-Jew, who was working in the Slavita press as a bookbinder, just committed suicide. He hung himself. Nobody knows particularly why, but a lot of the anti-Semites there wanted to blame the Jews, that they thought this guy knew something about some crime they were committing, and they killed him. And what happened to the printers was that they were sentenced to life in Siberia, but only after they went through the gauntlet of 500 soldiers hitting them. Literally, you walk through and you're smashed by a person. And they would have to go through the gauntlet, 150 hits. That means 3 times through the 500 and the like. And if they survived, and that would be very, very unlikely, they would go to Siberia. They did survive. In fact, it's even recorded that one of them lost his yarmulke in the middle, and he refused to move. He refused to move until they put the kippah on his head, and they just continued beating him and beating him and beating him and beating him, and he would not move. Anyway, they wound up going to Siberia. They spent 15 years. They would have been there for life. What happened was the Tsar died, Tsar Nicholas, and he was replaced by Tsar Alexander, his son, who was a little bit more humane, and he commuted their sentence. So they were whipped. They went through going through this gauntlet of 15 years in the horrendous conditions of Siberia. And they were tzaddikim. They said, we accept this as Hashem's punishment because we were pogeya in the kavod of Rabbi Akiva Eger. They accepted it. Horrendous story. I mean, even within Tsarist Russia, this was considered to be, even among secular historians, one of the greatest miscarriages of justice that ever occurred under the Tsar. And you got to be pretty bad. I mean, every decision the Tsars made were unjust and unfair, and this was considered to be the worst of the worst. This is a long story, but I'm just telling you to see the idea that when you're pogeya in the kavod of a gadol, there will be very, very serious consequences. We have to be very careful about that.